So Hirsch Voruganti is the Associate Director of Public Policy at the Hindu American Foundation. He holds a JD with honors from George Washington University Law School. He's also responsible for leading the Foundation's domestic policy priorities, including its work on strengthening the Establishment Clause and protecting the separation of church and state. Before joining the Hindu American Foundation staff, Mr. Voruganti worked as a fellow at the Program on Freedom of Religion and Belief at the American Civil Liberties Union. He also serves on the board of the DC Lawyers Chapter of the American Constitution Society and is a designated next generation leader with the organization. So everybody welcome Hirsch Voruganti.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Awesome. So thank you again to all of you for being here to hear me. And a special thank you to all the organizers at SSACon. Haven't they done an amazing job so far? And I'm not just saying that because they invited me. So as Kelly very helpfully laid out in her intro, my name is Hirsch Voruganti. I work for the Hindu American Foundation. And those of you who know the logic by now would assume that I am Hindu. And yes, that would be correct. So what am I as a Hindu doing here at a conference for atheist and secular students? And what am I going to talk with you here about? So before I get into that, I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story. So in this story, we go back to a long time ago, in 2013, a very long time ago, in a magical land called Arizona. Anyone here from Arizona, by the way? Oh, good. That'll make this easier. So in Arizona, their state legislature has a rule that says that members of their legislature can start their meetings off with a prayer if they want to. And this is okay, by the way. The Supreme Court has said this is okay in a 1983 decision called March v. Chambers. They said it's fine as long as the prayers are non-denominational, which we will come back to. So in 2013, a gentleman by the name of Juan Mendez, who was a member of the Arizona House of Representatives, I think many of you know where the story is going, he decided on a rather radical proposition that if invocations could be offered by religious people, there is no reason why it could not be offered by non-religious people. Shocking, I know. So when it was his turn to offer the invocation, he stepped forward and he gave a very respectful, very moving, non-religious invocation. And many of you actually, I think the invocation, the text of it is still available online if you guys want to go look it up, read it. And apparently the fact that he did this was such a big travesty that his fellow representatives in the Arizona State House decided to go back and redo the invocation. And they did this because in the words of one representative, what Representative Mendez did was not a real prayer. And so he went up and then offered another real prayer and asked for forgiveness for the prayer that was given earlier that day. So let's fast forward a couple years and move to Idaho. Anyone here from Idaho? This is good. I can say all these things so freely. So Idaho did something quite revolutionary early this year. They invited, for the first time in their history, the Idaho State Senate invited a Hindu preacher to come in and do their invocation. And this gentleman was a man by the name of Rajan Zed, who was quite used to doing invocations. He's done several across the country, including giving the first invocation before the U.S. Senate, which was, of course, shouted down by Christian extremists back in 2007. So this year, Rajan Zed was invited to speak before the Idaho State Senate. And for a member of the Idaho State Senate by the name of Steve Vick, this was an abomination. And when Rajan Zed spoke in 2007, it was outside people trying to shout him down. This time, apparently, it was members of the government itself. He released a statement saying basically that the United States was not formed to support the Hindu religion. It was formed on the Christian religion. And as such, there was no reason for the government to support or allow access to any other religion. He also threw in some stuff in there about Hindus worshiping cows, just for good measure. Just FYI, for the record, we don't worship cows. Even if we did, I don't see why that would disqualify us from giving an invocation. I mean, at least we all know cows exist. So, when Rajan Zed got up there to give his Hindu invocation, Senator Vic did the respectful thing and walked out with a few of his colleagues. I want to give you a third instance. Fast forward to April of this year. In Iowa, they decided, if you're from Iowa, awesome.
Be careful what you say. I'm just kidding. If it's bad, I'm on your side.
It's half good, half bad. So the Iowa State House extended an invitation to a Wiccan priestess to come and give the invocation before their assembly. And this was the first time in their history that they had ever done this. And of course, many members of the legislature, the majority of the House, decided not to show up in a sign of protest. And one member did something a little different. He asked himself, what would Jesus do? So he came, and then he turned around and faced in the opposite direction during the invocation. So I'm telling these stories basically to illustrate my main point, which is when it comes to religion in government, the way that members of minority faiths, such as Hindus, are treated, and Wiccans are treated, and the way that the non-religious are treated, is really not that different. And as such, when you're talking about these issues, they make very natural allies. And so as such, it is important for them to learn to work together and figure out which issues they can ally on to better be able to affect policy change. So as I had mentioned earlier, I work for the Hindu American Foundation. And for those of you who are unaware, the Hindu American community is actually one of the faster growing religious communities in the US. We have about 2.5 million individuals who practice Hinduism in the United States. We've got 843 plus temples. I had to look that up for this talk. And when I looked it up, I thought, wow, 843 temples, that's actually a lot more than I thought. So I was wondering, where are these temples located? So if you can see from this graph, this is kind of where the temples are located, and you can see a nice little square for Ohio there, so thank you, Ohio. One of those really tiny little squares there is Idaho, which goes a long way, I think, to explaining Senator Vic's reaction. But this is basically where the temples are located. So 843 temples, that's a pretty sizable religious infrastructure. Until, of course, you look at this. This is the comparison of Hindu temples in the United States, Jewish synagogues, Islamic mosques, and Christian churches. As you can see, there are over 300,000 Christian churches currently active in the United States today, and I'm pretty sure that's an undercount. If you add up all the numbers for the temples, synagogues, and mosques, there are still over 150 churches to every one of those. So this is basically the deficit of religious infrastructure that we in the Hindu community are working with. And so as such, for us to accomplish anything at all, we have to work with other groups. We can't do this by ourselves. So as such, we have learned to form alliances with other interfaith groups, and especially with other secular organizations, because we find that our work intersects with them a lot. So basically, the two main areas of intersection that I've found in my experience between Hindu advocacy and secular advocacy are, first of all, the separation of church and state, and second are human rights and the treatment of non-believers abroad. So let's address these in turn. The separation of church and state has been one of the main areas of my advocacy pretty much my entire legal career. It was when I started at the ACLU, and it certainly is now at the Hindu American Foundation. And one of the things that we have done is written amicus briefs to the Supreme Court. And I think we're a little unique we're definitely in the minority of religious organizations that we're usually writing to the Supreme Court to say, hey, we need less religion in government. And this puts us in the same space as a lot of other secular advocacy organizations. So basically what you're looking at here is the big circle is the entire universe of amicus briefs that the Hindu American Foundation has submitted. And within those circles, you'll see all the ones based on other organizations that have joined us on those briefs. And you can see that we have a lot of overlap with Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We have a pretty large overlap with the ACLU, smaller ones with Beckett Fund, Freedom from Religion Fund, American Atheists, Atheist Law Center. And if you consider the fact that this is the entire universe of amicus briefs we filed, not just the ones we filed on separation of church and state, you'll see that our agreement with them is almost unanimous on a lot of issues. So let's just give an example. How many of you are familiar with the Town of Greece versus Galloway case? Good, good. That makes my job easier. So remember when I was talking about Marsh v. Chambers earlier that said that you could have invocations in state legislatures as long as they were non-denominational. So basically, in the Town of Greece case, which the Hindu American Foundation and all of these organizations, we submitted amicus briefs saying to the Supreme Court, basically, don't extend Marsh v. Chambers. Don't extend prayer to other governmental bodies. Don't allow sectarian prayer at governmental bodies. And the Supreme Court ignored all of this and went ahead and did exactly that. They said two things, basically. First, that Marsh v. Chambers also applies to boards such as city councils, town councils, municipal boards. And the second thing they said is, remember that non-denominational part that we threw into Marsh v. Chambers? Yeah, we don't really mean that. So if you want to do a denominational invocation or denominational prayer, it's not government's job to step in. Unless, of course, you are Juan Mendez and you're giving an atheist prayer, in which case people will think that that is not a real prayer. Let me tell you right now, when town councilors are thinking about getting people in for sectarian prayer, they're not really sitting there being like, oh, if only I could invite a Hindu to come in and give a sectarian prayer, but drat, Marsh v. Chambers says it has to be non-denominational. Usually when they mean sectarian prayer, they mean Christian prayer. And as such, non-Christian minority faith groups generally fall into the same line as non-religious groups in working to try and prevent that, because both of them have the same interest, that they don't want to see the government endorse one faith over their own beliefs. So that's one big area of cooperation. And the other big area of cooperation is international human rights. How many of you are familiar with the case of Dr. Avijit Roy? At least a few of you. I see that Steph from CFI is definitely familiar with it. But Dr. Avijit Roy was a gentleman, a US citizen based out of Atlanta, who went to Bangladesh on a work trip and was brutally murdered in public in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And he was murdered because he was an atheist blogger who was writing criticizing religious extremism. And the Hindu American Foundation releases a human rights report every year, basically documenting the countries in which Hindu minorities are treated poorly, the ones in which their religious rights are restricted. And you'll see right there, I apologize, this is not as big as it could be, but you can see Bangladesh is right there, which is one of our serial offender countries. So when we found out about Dr. Roy's case, we were definitely very concerned. I myself have actually a slight personal connection to Dr. Roy. He's actually a good family friend of someone very close to me. But we got involved and worked with CFI and other groups to try to make sure that justice was done in Dr. Roy's case. But if you look at all the countries highlighted as the ones in which Hindus are persecuted, you will notice that almost all of them are also countries in which atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, and secularists are persecuted. If you overlay the two maps on each other, they're almost identical. And so this is another area in which we have found cooperation with allies. We've found allies in groups such as CFI, groups such as the American Humanist Association, and working in conjunction with them rather than just trying to go it alone because our interests are unified. So I've spent a lot of time talking about what it means to what we've done in working with allies. So basically, how can you translate that to your work on campus? So the important thing to note, and again, this is not rocket science, is when you're reaching out to allied organizations, you have to remember that just because they're an ally does not mean you will agree with them on every single issue. It also doesn't mean that you're going to agree with them on the majority of issues. We ally with organizations that we disagree with on a lot of things. But what we do is we choose to focus on the things that unite us rather than the things that divide us, not to sound like President Obama. But we have worked with Christian groups that we disagree with on their abortion politics or their work on proselytization and conversion, but who we agree with on religious visa issues or who we agree with on immigration issues. These are the kind of alliances that it's important to draw. And basically how you're going to do this is you have to go issue by issue, identify the issues that are most important for you to push on either on your campus or in your state government, your local government, or even at the federal level. And if you've identified an issue, then go through the local groups in the area and say who else shares a common interest in this particular issue. Now, obviously, there are going to be some people you're just not going to be able to work with. But I think you'll find, surprisingly, the vast majority of people, especially when you're talking to organizations of minority faith groups, will have a lot in common with you, a lot more in common with secular groups than they have separating them. So if you're doing that, you'll find that you're actually able to accomplish a lot more working together than you ever would individually. And I want to give an example of that. If you look at our logo, actually, sorry, it's not in our logo, but if you look at our website, one of the symbols that you will see fairly prominently is the swastika. Now, the swastika, most of you may know, is a fairly ancient symbol that's been used for thousands of years as a symbol of prosperity in many Eastern religions. It's very sacred in Hinduism, but it's also used in religions such as Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, as well as Western religions, such as many Native American religions, use the swastika. And as almost all of you are aware, in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler used it as a symbol of the Nazi Party in Germany, and ever since then, it has been used repeatedly by numerous hate groups as a symbol of hate and terror. Last year, actually earlier this year, a Jewish student at George Washington University went to India and saw how common the use of the symbol was there, divorced from any of the connotations of the Nazi Party. Excited by this, he bought a replica of the Hindu swastika, took it back to his dorm, and put it up to show his excitement that something that has such an ingrained meaning of hate in the Western context has such a different meaning in the Eastern context. For this action, George Washington University tried to expel him. They argued that regardless of why he put it up, and regardless of what the symbol was that he actually put up, the fact that someone could mistake it for the Nazi symbol meant that he should be treated the same, and that leads to expulsion. And when this came up, he obviously hired legal counsel to defend himself, but he didn't really know who to reach out to. And then eventually, somehow, we got a hold of it, and we reached out to him. We talked to him and his counsel, and then we reached out to Buddhist groups, to Jain groups, to Native American groups. We reached out to the campus Hindu groups, to the campus secular groups, the campus atheist groups, groups that otherwise would not be doing a lot of things together, but who had a common interest in making sure that a student was not expelled for putting up a symbol in his dorm. So we worked together. We worked on getting letters out to the university president. We worked on making sure that they understood that what they were doing was a rash overreaction. And to be fair, we never said through any of this that he should not be punished. But we argued that expelling him was the wrong punishment. And by working together, we managed to get the university to change their mind. They decided not to expel him, and instead to just keep the amount of time that he'd been suspended and allow him to return to campus. And because of our cooperation, because of working together with allies, we were able to accomplish something that I can guarantee you we would never have been able to accomplish if we were the only group doing up there. So with that, so that's what I want to leave you guys with, is please don't be afraid to engage with faith groups, especially minority faith groups, because you will find that they have a lot more things in common with you than are the things that are separating you guys. And I know I have 2 minutes left, so I'll leave those 2 minutes for questions.